If you talk to someone who has lived in New York for 50 or 60 years, you will hear something that sounds like grief. They look at the glass towers, the luxury flats, the crowds lining up for the latest trend, and they say the same words. This is not the New York I grew up in. Today, we are stepping back into the New York that existed before polish and branding. The city old New Yorkers still carry with them, and the loss that never quite fades. The first thing anyone remembers about old New York is the noise. Not the curated noise of today, not the hum of air conditioning units and rideshare apps pinging, but real noise. Aggressive, unapologetic, human noise. Car horns that never stopped because patience was not a New York virtue. Voices shouting across streets, through windows, down fire escapes. The rattle of subway trains echoing up from the grates. Radios blasting salsa from fifth-floor apartments in Washington Heights. Soul from Harlem brownstones. Rock from East Village bars. The city did not have a soundtrack. The city was a soundtrack. And here is the thing that people who never experienced it do not understand. That noise was not chaos. It was connection. It was proof that millions of people were living right on top of each other and somehow making it work. The sound was the city breathing. When old New Yorkers say things feel different now, this is part of what they mean. The streets have gotten quieter, and somehow that quiet feels lonelier than all that noise ever did. The New York of memory was not built for tourists. It was built by hands, working-class hands. Generations of families who woke up early took the train to factories or docks or construction sites and came home to neighborhoods that smelled like whatever their grandmothers were cooking. These blocks were not destinations. Nobody was writing travel guides about Astoria in 1972 or reviewing the best brunch spots in Bushwick. These were places where people lived, where they raised kids and buried parents and watched decades pass from the same stoop. There was pride in that. Pride in knowing every face on your block. Pride in watching your neighbor's kid grow up and get a job at the same union hall where your father worked. New York was a city of ambition, yes, but for most people, that ambition was simple. Stay, build something, pass it on. The working-class blocks were the backbone of this city, and when those families got priced out, something in the spine of New York cracked. If you wanted to understand what made old New York different, you had to understand what rent meant, or rather, what it did not mean. Rent was low enough that failure was survivable. You could lose a job, take a risk, start something foolish, fall flat on your face, and still have a roof over your head the next month. That breathing room changed everything. It meant a 23-year-old could move to Manhattan with $200 in their pocket and figure it out. It meant musicians could play for tips and still eat. It meant writers could write, painters could paint, and dreamers could dream without a trust fund or a side hustle destroying their focus. Cheap rent was not just an economic detail. It was the foundation of an entire culture. And when that foundation was pulled out, the culture collapsed with it. Every block in old New York had its own economy. A butcher who knew how your mother liked her pork chops sliced. A baker who saved the end pieces of bread for the kids who came in with coins. A bodega owner who let you run a tab when times were hard. A record shop where the guy behind the counter would argue with you for an hour about whether Coltrane peaked with A Love Supreme or kept climbing after. These were not businesses in the way we think of businesses now. They were relationships. The shopkeepers knew your name, your story, your family. They watched you grow up. When they saw you coming down the street, they started preparing your usual order before you even walked in. That is not nostalgia. That is community. And when the rents rose and the chains moved in, those relationships disappeared. You can get coffee on every corner in New York now, but nobody knows your name. Have you ever been on a train so packed that you could feel a stranger's heartbeat against your back? Have you ever watched a mariachi band squeeze through a crowded car, playing for quarters while the train lurched and swayed? That was the New York subway. Dirty, loud, unreliable. Covered in graffiti that ranged from vandalism to genuine art, the trains broke down constantly. The stations smelled like things you did not want to identify. And none of that mattered, because the subway was the great equalizer. A billionaire and a dishwasher standing shoulder to shoulder, holding the same greasy pole, trying not to fall when the brakes hit hard. The subway did not care who you were. It moved the whole city, all of it, together. There was democracy in that grime. When they cleaned it up, they sanitized something more than just the cars. Old New York was not safe. Let us be honest about that. Crime was real. Muggings happened. Certain blocks after dark were genuinely dangerous. But here is what outsiders never understood. New Yorkers did not live in fear. They lived in awareness. There is a difference. You learned to read a street the way a sailor reads the water. You knew which corners to avoid, which subway cars felt wrong, which strangers wanted conversation, and which wanted your wallet. Your head stayed up. Your eyes stayed open. You moved with purpose because hesitation was invitation. This was not paranoia. This was rhythm. It was a skill passed down from older siblings and sharp-eyed grandmothers. And in a strange way, it made you feel capable. You survived New York every single day. That meant something. Children in old New York had something that seems almost impossible now. They had freedom, real freedom. 7-year-olds running to the corner store alone. 10-year-olds taking the subway across boroughs to visit cousins. 12-year-olds playing stickball in the street until someone's mother leaned out a window and screamed that dinner was ready. Parents were not negligent. The city was simply understood differently. It was dangerous, yes, but it was also yours. You learned its rules early. You learned how to handle yourself, how to navigate crowds, how to talk your way out of trouble. By the time you were a teenager, you had already lived more city than most adults experience in a lifetime. That early independence shaped people. It made them resilient, resourceful, and unafraid of the world. What did we lose when we bubble-wrapped childhood? New York was built by immigrants, not in some symbolic way, literally built. The Italians in Little Italy, the Irish in Hell's Kitchen, the Jews on the Lower East Side, the Puerto Ricans in East Harlem, the Dominicans in the Heights, the Chinese in Chinatown. Each group carved out a piece of the city and made it home. They opened businesses, raised families, built churches and temples and community centers. They planted roots so deep that their grandchildren could still feel them. And then something cruel happened. Those neighborhoods became desirable. The same streets that mainstream America once avoided became trendy. And the families who built them, who stayed through the hard decades, who made those places worth wanting, they got pushed out, priced out, replaced by people who wanted the culture without the people who created it. That is not progress. That is erasure. There is a reason so much important art came out of New York in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. It was not because the city attracted talent. It was because the city let talent survive. A painter could rent a loft in Soho for almost nothing. A musician could live in the East Village and spend every waking hour on their craft. A writer could wait tables twice a week and write novels the rest of the time. The city did not subsidize art. It just did not crush it. Creativity needs time. Time needs cheap rent. When young artists today talk about how impossible it feels to make it in New York, they are not complaining. They are stating a mathematical reality. You cannot create when you are working 3 jobs to afford a room in a shared apartment 90 minutes from Manhattan. The hunger that made New York's art scene legendary, that hunger still exists. What is gone is the space to feed it. Times Square in the 1970s was not family-friendly. It was neon and chaos and genuine danger. Peep shows and hustlers and 3-card Monte dealers and marquees advertising films you would never tell your mother about. It was loud and sleazy and slightly terrifying, and old New Yorkers will tell you something that sounds crazy. They miss it. Not the crime, not the exploitation, but the rawness, the honesty of it. Times Square did not pretend to be anything other than what it was. It was the it of the city, the place where all the uncomfortable truths gathered under blinking lights. Now it is billboards and chain restaurants and tourists taking selfies. Safer, yes, but also empty. A performance of a city rather than the city itself. When people say New York lost its soul, Times Square is often what they are picturing. Here is something that younger generations find hard to believe. People used to be born, grow old, and die in the same borough, the same neighborhood, sometimes the same block. New York was not a phase. It was not a 5-year adventure before moving somewhere with a backyard. It was a life. Your grandmother lived upstairs. Your cousins lived around the corner. Your childhood best friend became your adult best friend because neither of you ever left. The city held generations together, and that continuity created something irreplaceable. When you walk down your street, you walk through layers of your own history. This is where you had your first kiss. This is where your father proposed to your mother. This is where your son learned to ride a bike. When lifetime residents got pushed out, they did not just lose apartments. They lost timelines. They lost themselves. Old New York never promised you comfort. It promised you something better. It promised you that if you could survive it, you could survive anything. The city was hard. The winters were brutal. The summers were suffocating. The people were aggressive, and nobody was going to hold your hand. And in exchange for enduring all of that, you got opportunity. You got access. You got the chance to become someone. That deal, that brutal, honest deal, is what old New Yorkers feel has disappeared. The city got softer, yes, more polished, more pleasant in many ways. But something was lost in the transaction. The edge that made people sharp. The struggle that made success meaningful. The rawness that made the city feel like it was alive in your hands rather than something you simply consumed. When an old New Yorker says this is not the city they grew up in, they are not resisting change. They are remembering a place that shaped them. Loud, hard, and real. That New York still lives in memory, in voices, and in stories passed down. If you remember it, or someone close to you does, share it below. Because as long as it is remembered, it is never truly gone.